Privacy, past and future. In this video, I am going to put on my futurology hat and take another look at what is happening to privacy. My particular brand of futurology is not predicting the future by making guesses. My approach is to predict the present, namely taking a sideways look at the trends that are appearing in the here and now. Privacy is often presented as a timeless human right. However, historically, it is a relatively recent concept, and its actual meaning has changed repeatedly along with the evolution of technology, economics, and power. My analysis presents a stark view. The information age will transform society into a new technological order where identity, privacy, and even reality itself become commodities. The central argument I want to explore today is that privacy is disappearing, not accidentally, rather by being systematically transformed as identity itself becomes property. Historically, most human societies operated with limited identification systems. For most of human history, individuals lived in small communities where identity was known socially rather than bureaucratically. Documentation was rare. Passports, national identity cards, and bureaucratic records only became widespread in the modern age. States have always wanted they've always wanted to identify the citizens, considering them as taxation in waiting, while businesses increasingly wanted to identify customers. The combination of these two forces, political administration and commercial marketing, have created powerful incentives to collect personal data. People used to be socially visible but institutionally anonymous. This has flipped over. Nowadays, we are institutionally visible but increasingly socially anonymous. This transformation has occurred alongside the rise of large bureaucracies, databases, and digital networks. My analysis of this transformation uses the concept of enclosure. Now, enclosure originally referred to privatisation of the commons, the common land in England. In the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, land that had been previously shared by communities was fenced off and turned into private property. I argue that the same process is happening today. But instead of land, the target is identity itself. Identity is being sampled and converted into databases of biometric, behavioral, and demographic data, which then function as proxies for individuals. Once identity is represented as data, it can be owned, traded, monetized, and controlled. And this process turns identity into economic property. In other words, we no longer own our own identities. We rent access to them from institutions. I consider modern society to be a database society. Our identities now exist simultaneously in government records, banking systems, social media platforms, medical databases, surveillance systems. These databases act as authoritative versions of the self. Now, I'm warning you that eventually the database may become more real than the individual. The data record becomes the legal truth. If a database record is incorrect, then the individual may struggle to prove their own identity or claim that they even exist. This leads to a startling conclusion. The real danger is not identity theft by criminals, but identity ownership by institutions, what I claim to be the ultimate identity theft. Now, the notion of privacy is closely linked to power. As the individual loses privacy, power shifts to those who control information. Then, for example, politically problematic individuals can even be cancelled, barring them from everything they own, including barring them from their own identity. This dynamic can be seen in the modern relationship between governments and technology companies. Large technology corporations collect enormous amounts of personal data through search engines, smartphones, social media, and location services. This can be seen in the way that companies such as Microsoft, Google, and Facebook farm personal data by recording behavior, location, and communications. Data therefore becomes the raw material of the digital economy. The individual becomes both consumer and product. To understand the deeper implications of this transformation, it is helpful to consider the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who argued that societies periodically undergo re-evaluations of values. Traditional moral assumptions collapse and new value systems emerge. Interpreting through this lens, in the industrial age, the dominant values included privacy, citizenship, employment, national identity. But the information age is creating a new hierarchy of values centered around data, mobility, networks, economic efficiency. In Nietzschean terms, the old moral framework of privacy is being replaced by a technological value system based on the extraction of information. In the New Barbarian Manifesto, I argued that the information age will create a new elite, the new barbarians. These individuals and corporations will operate across borders, exploiting global networks, all the while remaining largely independent of both national regulations and the enclosure of their data. Technology enables organizations to relocate to wherever taxes, regulation, and enclosure are lowest. Globalization, combined with telecommunication networks, undermine traditional institutions such as employment and the nation state. The state is the usual agent of enclosure through compulsory purchase orders. The elite, meanwhile, will thrive in a world where data flows freely and enclosure and regulation struggle to keep up. But this transformation has consequences, namely increasing inequality, weakening democratic control, and the erosion of the protection of privacy for the ordinary people. Furthermore, we must also consider another insight, important for the privacy debate, namely the assumption that human reasoning can be reduced to purely logical systems. I argue that human cognition evolved biologically and thrives on ambiguity, uncertainty, and contextual judgment. Logic is an artificial island constructed within the irrational complexity of reality, and that believing humans can be reduced to logical machines is naive. However, modern surveillance and data analysis rely heavily on algorithmic reasoning. But if human behavior cannot be fully captured by logical models, then algorithmic profiling of identity inevitably produces errors and misinterpretations. And yet these imperfect systems increasingly determine credit scores, insurance premiums, job opportunities, criminal risk assessment, etc., etc. Thus, technological systems attempt to impose logical certainty onto inherently ambiguous human behavior. I argue that modern society increasingly constructs reality through technological systems. Information systems do not merely describe the world, they create the world that institutions act upon. For example, financial markets exist primarily as digital information systems. Social media constructs social identity through profiles and metrics. Algorithmic rankings shape visibility and reputation. Now, as technological mediation increases, individuals interact less with physical reality and more with digital representations, which means that the data representation of a person becomes socially and economically decisive, leading to the erosion of privacy. Let's consider some real-world examples. Number one, mass surveillance. Government surveillance programs have expanded dramatically since the early 2000s. Large-scale interception of communications by intelligence agencies has revealed how extensively personal communications are being monitored. Social media data mining. Platforms collect vast behavioral data sets. One widely discussed example is the Facebook Cambridge Analytica data scandal, where personal data was harvested to influence political campaigns. 3. Biometric identification. Biometric systems such as facial recognition, fingerprint databases, iris scans are increasingly being used by governments and corporations. Such systems create centralized identity registers, which may become the authoritative version of an individual, not the living individual itself. And number 4, intellectual property and biopiracy. There are cases where biological material from individuals have been patented for commercial use. In one case, cells taken from a patient during medical treatment were later patented and commercialized by researchers. And this raises complex questions about ownerships of biological identity. Now, in Flight of the Golden Geese, which I wrote with David Lesperance, I discussed how wealthy individuals and corporations increasingly relocate internationally to minimize taxation, illustrating a broader theme in my work. Technology enables elites to become geographically mobile, while ordinary citizens remain tied to national systems. As a result, the state may rely even more heavily on monitoring and regulating its remaining population. This dynamic further increases pressure for surveillance and identity management systems. Privacy becomes the sole benefit of the rich. So, what does my future look like? I predict several trends. 1. Identity systems will become central infrastructure, linking property ownership, financial transactions, healthcare, travel, and employment. 2. Continuous surveillance. Devices such as smartphones, sensors, and wearables are already creating constant streams of personal behavioral data. Automated governance. Decisions that were once made by humans will increasingly be made by algorithms operating on personal data. 4. The loss of anonymity. True anonymity will become extremely rare in highly networked societies, apart, that is, from high net worth individuals. Now, returning to Nietzsche, I interpret these developments as a radical transformation in the structure of power. Nietzsche believed that societies eventually abandon moral ideas that no longer serve their underlying power structures. If privacy becomes economically inconvenient, institutions may gradually redefine it as obsolete. The disappearance of privacy will not be a technological side effect, rather a cultural shift in values. Let me conclude with 3 key insights. First, privacy is historically contingent. It emerged under particular social and technological conditions, and it will not survive the information age unchained. Secondly, the digital economy is transforming identity itself into property, creating incentives to collect, store, and exploit personal data on individuals, and that data belongs to somebody else. Third, technological systems increasingly shape the reality within which social institutions operate. In the name of protecting identity from theft, we may be surrendering ownership of identity itself. The future of privacy, therefore, depends not only on technology, but on political choices, economic incentives, and cultural values. I believe we are witnessing the next stage of a long process, the enclosure of the last remaining commons, namely the self. Thank you.